coincide with Moshe Rabbeinu's yahrzeit, because really, Moshe Rabbeinu's yahrzeit was very, very fundamental in the whole Inyan, the whole nace of Purim, because as Mispa Yamecha Amalei, Hashem says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Memale Shnosim Shel Tzadikim Miyom El Yom. Moshe Rabbeinu was born on Zion Adar, and he was nostalgic on Zion Adar, right? Yeah. Okay. So now, when Haman had his gorel Miyom LeYom Mechodesh LeChodesh, and he came LeChodesh Shneim Asar UChodesh Adar, the Samach Simcha Gedola, he was very, very happy with this, because he felt that this was the month that Moshe Rabbeinu was nostalgic, and he felt that it meant that the mazel of Yisrael was in a very, 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 very low madrega, and therefore he felt that it was a time that was very, very auspicious, for him to carry out whatever he wished to do. Okay. What he didn't take into account was that it was the Chodesh Adar, the Zayin Adar, also really was the birth date of Moshe Rabbeinu, and there were also there are many explanations as to why he saw exactly. After all, I mean, a person doesn't live from the time of the Chet of the Eitz Hadas. No one is going to live forever, right? Don't live forever. So therefore, every person has to die at some time. So there are many, many explanations, but I'll call upon him this fact that Moshe Rabbeinu died, his yahrzeit, that his birthday is on Zion Adar. Each party, looked at it from a different perspective. Haman thought that it was very, very fortuitous for him, and in reality it was not, because the Leida, the schus of Moshe Rabbeinu was Megan. Okay, so that it's a source of a lot of speculation as to why the name of Moshe Rabbeinu was absent from the Pasha of Tetzaveh, right? It doesn't appear in Pasha's Tetzaveh, right? And it's associated. Most of the Mefarshim explain that it's because Zion Adar, which is the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu, falls out always during, mostly, I shouldn't say always, there are some exceptions, but Zion Adar falls out always, mostly during the week of Pashas Tetzaveh, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu's name isn't mentioned in Tetzaveh. Others say that they add because Moshe Rabbeinu said Mecheni no mesifrecha, that the Chet Egel, he said that if you're not going to forgive the Klal Yisrael, Mecheni no mesifrecha, and that klala was had to be fulfilled at least b'miktzas. So therefore his name was eliminated from the Pasha, which is current, the week of his yahrzeit. It's interesting that Ve'ata Tetzaveh B'nai Yisrael, the Ve'ata is obviously Moshe Rabbeinu, so he's not mentioned by name, he's mentioned by reference, right? Ve'ata. And it says that the name Moshe, Mem Shin Hei, there's a Golu and a Seiser, right? The Seiser of the Osius of Moshe are the Mem and the Shin and the Hey. Mem is spelled, like we always talk about the Miloi of the Os, right? The way that the Os is spelled. Mem is spelled Mem. So the second Mem, which represents the spelling of the name, that's the Seiser. So the Mem is 40. The Shin is Shin Yud Nun. Yud Nun is the Seiser is 60, right? And the Hey is Hey Aleph, okay, which is 1. The Seiser is 1. So the Mem, the Seiser of the Mem, the Seiser of the Shin, which is Yud Nun, and the Seiser of the Aleph together are 101. 101 is the number of psukim in Parshas Tetzaveh, right? So although Moshe Rabbeinu isn't present Begala, he's present Beseser. There are many other, that's the Gross says this. I wanted, perhaps we'll come back to this a little bit, later on in the evening. And we learned in Megillah, the beginning in Daf Daled, Daf Gimel actually, Tanya, Kohanim, Ba'avodosam, V'Leviim, B'Duchonam, V'Yisrael, B'Mamodam, Kulam, Mevatlin, Avodosam, Avon, Lishma, Mikra, Megillah. Now this, because remember that the nace of Purim occurred at the end of the 70 years of the Golus Bavel, right? And shortly afterwards, the Beis Hamikdash was rebuilt, and it stood for over 400 years. And during that time, during those 400 years, Purim was celebrated. So the Baraisa says that the Kohanim b'avodosim, Leviim b'duchonim, Yisrael b'mamodim, kulam mevatlin avodosim avoin lishma mikra Megillah. So they mevatl their avodah, and they come to hear mikra Megillah. Now, Tosfos explains that this means that they, as opposed to reading the Megillah b'yechidus, or in small minyanim here and there, they come Barav Am Hadras Melech. There was a place there. Remember, there was a Beis HaKnesses in the Azara, whatever it is. But they come together and they listen to Mikra Megillah. And the Beraisa goes on. Mekan Samchu Shal Beis Rebbe Shemevatlim Talmud Torah Uvon Lishma Mikra Megillah. Okay, and from here, the Beis Rebbe, right, where. And I remember Rebbe was after the Churban. This was many, many years later. But Mekan Samchu Shel Beis Rebbe Shemevatlim Talmud Torah V'on Lishma Mikra Megillah, that they used this as a smach, that they were Mevatl Talmud Torah, and they came to hear the Mikra Megillah. Okay. Fine. This is Kal V'chomer Ma'avoda Shichamura Mevatlim Talmud Torah. Mevatlin, rather Kama Talmud Torah Lakolshkein, the Avodah so Chomer, and the Baraisa says we'll mevatl the Avodah for Talmud Torah, for Mikra Megillah. So certainly Talmud Torah. Then the Gemara discusses whether indeed really the Avodah is more Chomer than Talmud Torah. But Al Kol Ponim, the Beis Rebbe relied on the Kohanim and the Leviim, since they were mevatl their Avodah to come to listen to the Mikra Megillah berabim, beravam. So they did the same, even though it was a Talmud Torah derabim. Okay, fine. So Tosfos asks several very interesting points here in the Tosfos, and Tosfos asks that why do you say that they were mevatel the avodah? They came, they davened in the morning, they heard the Megillah, and afterwards they would do the avodah. They did the avodah a little bit later. As I remember from the Mishnah, the 5th parak of Psachim of Tamid Nishchat, when that Mishnah really pertains more to the Tamid Shal Ben Ha'aboyim, but the Tamid Shal Shachar was brought in the morning. So that day they brought it a little bit later. So Tosfos says, well, why was it that wasn't mevatlim then? So Tosfos says that since there was the Iker Zman was from the time of the Heir HaMizrach, and they deferred it on account of Mikra Megillah, so that's called mevatlim. Tosfos says that they did this because of Berov Am Hadras Melech. So Tosfos's shita is definitely that if for some reason it would not be possible to be Mekayim both Mikra Megillah and the Avodah, then the Mikra Megillah would not be Doicha the Avodah. Because Tosfos says that the Brais, when it says Mevatlin, it's lav dafke Mevatlin, it means it's deferred. You defer it, right? A little bit later. But if the Mikra Megillah would be at the expense entirely of the Avodah, right, then the Avodah would take precedence because it's deraisa. Right? there in Daf Gimel Amud Aleph in Megillah, so in the Gilyon Hashas, Rabbi Akiva Eiger refers to a Piskei Tosfos in Erechen. The Piskei Tosfos, so you see in the back of every Masechta, you have the Piskei Tosfos are like a synopsis of all of each Tosfos, of what emerges lahalacha from everything. Because remember, the Tosfos are all very, very much barichas, and many of the Tosfos don't come to any halachic conclusion. But where the Tosfos comes to some kind of halachic conclusion, so the Piskei Tosfos, which was also evidently by the Talmidim of the Balei Tosfos, so it states that this and this halacha lemaise is derived from the Tosfos. Fine. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger refers to the Piskei Tosfos and Erechen, and you refer to the Piskei Tosfos and Erechen, and you see that the Piskei Tosfos does not agree with our Tosfos. The Piskei Tosfos says that although there might be a situation that you would be unable to mekayem both, and if you lame the Megillah, you would have to be mevatel the avodah that day entirely, right? Nevertheless, Mikra Megillah takes precedence, not like our Tosfos. Okay? One is, how could that be? The avodah is, it's midaraisa, and it's much more than that because remember, Avram Avinu is b'mo'eda ki ereshena, and Hashem answered him the schus of the karbonos. Nevertheless, the persume nisa of Mikra Megillah, the Piskei Tosfos holds, is stronger. Okay, it takes precedence, not like our Tosfos. All right. It's interesting that there's a sefer there, the Reach Dudoyim. The Reach Dudoyim is from the Bnei Yisachar, and he asks a very an insightful question on our Tosfos, because our Tosfos says that the avodah itself isn't nidche. But in the event that you could not do both the avodah and the Mikra Megillah, then the Mikra Megillah has to, right, give way to the avodah. All right, that's what. So he says, if so, then what is the? It says mekan samchu shel beis rabbi shemevatlin talmud Torah boin Mikra Megillah. It says Torah is not like this. It's the avodah. If let's say the zman of the avodah of the Talmud shel ben Ashachar was from the time of the Netzach Hama. Okay, it was early in the morning, and because of Mikra Megillah, it was deferred by an hour. So what have you lost? You've lost the time. You've lost the hour. Okay, you've lost the zrizin magdim and lemitzvus, and you're not really liable for that either, because you're doing it at the instruction, upon the instruction of the Chachamim, who say to defer it. So what have you lost? Nothing, right? You're doing both the Mikra Megillah and the avodah. If, however, you're mevatel Talmud Torah at a given time, that Talmud Torah will never, that hour of Talmud Torah that you didn't learn will not come back. Right? That's gone. That's why the Chazal say that Adam doeg al ibud ma'osav, the ein Adam doeg al ibud sha'osav. A person worries about losing money, but he doesn't concern himself with losing time. And it's just because ma'os chozrim, sha'os einon chozrim. Money will come, you lose and you make it. You make it back. You lose an hour, it's gone. Okay? So the Reach Dudoyim asks that how could you learn from the avodah to be mevatel Talmud Torah? Tosfos says that the avodah you're really not mevatel, you're only deferring it. But if the entire yeshiva of Rebbe, which was at that time the preeminent yeshiva in the world, right? If you mevatel that for an hour or two, that zman is gone, right? So here it's only a dechiyah, and here it's a real bittul. So the Bnei Yisachar says that that's why the Baraisa says mekan somchu. They relied upon this. They compared this to. They really didn't learn from it because there is a significant difference. And if one would really want to make a limud, there's a pircha. Because the Talmud Torah will never come back. Then the avodah, you do it an hour later. Okay? Fine. That's what he put. So he says that's why the Chachamim used the mekan somchu. They didn't want to use a stronger, because it can't really be derived through a kal v'chomer, because the situations are different. All of this is based on the shita of the Balei Tosfos here, that Mikra Megillah takes precedence, but it is not dolcha a mitzvah daraisa. The same would be for tefillah. If for some reason it would be tefillah is the Rabbanah, that would Kriya Shema, let's say. If for some reason it would be impossible to lein Kriya Shema and read the Megillah, then according to Tosfos, the Megillah would be nidcha. If it would be if a mitzvah daraisa stands in the way of Mikra Megillah, and it's a question which takes precedent at the moment, then, although we daven first and we read the Megillah only in the morning, only after Kriyas HaTorah, but it could, but even a mitzvah daraisa, you can defer it for a few hours to be able to read the Megillah, okay? But you can't be mevatel it. That's the sheet of Tosfos. Now, the Mechaber says in the end of Tofresh Peizayin, mevatel and Talmud Torah, Shema Mikra Megillah, Kal v'chomer l'shar mitzvahs. Mevatel, right? And he goes on and says that the only time that Mikra Megillah is really nidche is if one finds a meis mitzvah, and he has to be metapel to bury the meis mitzvah, then all mitzvahs, including Mikra Megillah, are nidche. But other than that, Mikra Megillah always takes precedence. And then the Ramah is v'chol zeh lo mari ela b'di'ika shos laser shteihem. Only if both can be done. Aval im yefshal laser shteihem. If, however, both cannot be done, ein shum mitzvah daraisa nitches mipnei Mikra Megillah. Okay, because if one has to be, eliminated entirely, then it has to be Mikra Megillah. If it's a question of kedima, which should be first, then Mikra Megillah is first. But if it's a question of one being totally eliminated, then you eliminate Mikra Megillah because a mitzvah daraisa takes precedence. That's what the Ramah says, and the Mogen Avram agrees. The Ramah brings this Tosfos that we're talking about, and the Ran. However, the Ran says, the Taz says, Hagozu kula medivrei Haran v'hamizrachi. He says that this opinion is the Ran and the Mizrachi. The Mizrachi who wrote on Rashi, explanation of Rashi, and of course the Tosfos, in the beginning of Megillah. The kvar kasafti mashiyesh lahakshus al zeh. Okay, and he said it before. He said, I've already written what the difficulties are with this shita. The Gam Mare V'Chamizal, his father-in-law, the Bach, Pirish Divrei Atur Al Pi Haderach Shezachati Besambo. He says, the Bach agreed with me, and he says that his conclusion is that the Ramah isn't right, and that when we say Mevatlen Avoda Lishma Mikra Megillah, the Piskei Tosfos was right, and even if it would mean that you would be mevatel the avodah for that day legamrei, right, entirely, Mikra Megillah takes precedence because of presumption. Okay? So you have here, and I think that the Gra holds the same, I believe so, and they say that the presumption is so strong that the presumption is doich the Mikra Megillah, even where the Mikra Megillah has to be in ganzen eliminated. Okay? This is the basic machlokas Rishonim, which actually was expressed later on by the Ramah and the Taz is how we hold it. The Ramah held like the Tosas and Megillah, and the Taz held like the Piskei Tosas and Erechen, that Mikra Megillah takes precedence even where the result would be the Bittul Mikra, the Bittul Avoda, or any other mitzvah daraisa totally. Okay? That's what he says. You know that we have later on in Daf Yud, we have a whole series of Tanoim and Amoraim, and each one offers a certain hakdama to the Mikra Megillah. That Rabbi Yonasan Posach lePischa lahai Pashata mehoche, that when he and Rashi says when he began to teach the Megillah, he would give the following hakdama. Each one brought a pasuk from Tanakh, and he would explain, and this would be his introduction to his instruction regarding the Mikra Megillah. Why is this necessary? We don't find this in any other book of the Tanakh. We never find such a thing. And the answer is because later on there's a machlokas between Reb Meir and Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, exactly how much of the Megillah has to be read. Not all of the Tanoim held that you have to read the entire Megillah. Some say that you have to only read from Balayla Ahu Nadadosh Melach. Some say that you read from Ish Yehudi Haya B'Shushan Habira. Some say that you read from Achad Dvarim Haya Lagid Al HaMelech Achashverosh as Haman. Right? Let's say that's a... Now, so therefore, the Tanoim and the Amoraim wanted to offer, and each one of those opinions holds that the Ikar Nes begins there. Right? That the Ikar Nes begins with Ish Yehudi, or the Ikar Nes begins with Balayla Ahu Nadadosh Nas HaMelech. So therefore, the Tanoim and the Amoraim each gave an introduction, a preamble to the Megillah, that we should understand, according to their various opinions, where the Ikar Nes begins and what the Ikar Nes was. Now, we find that Rabbi Lazar, the Gemara says Rabbi Lazar, and remember Rabbi Lazar was a Talmid Chaver of Rabbi Yochanan, and he was from the earliest Amoraim, and we also, that's Rabbi Lazar ben Pedos, and he's called the Stam Amore B'Shas. Whenever there's an opinion in the Shas and there's no name, that opinion was Rabbi Lazar ben Pedos. And Rabbi Lazar Pasach like Pischa lahai Pashat Me'ach. When he began to explain the Megillah, right? When he would begin to explain the Megillah, his introduction would be from this pasuk. Okay. Ba'atzaltayim yimach hamekora. He says that when a person is lazy, and this is a pasuk in Tehillim, thank you. When a person is lazy, yimach hamekora, eventually his roof is going to cave in. He neglects his house, he neglects his property, and it deteriorates. So he explains that this b'shvil atzlas shahoya b'hem b'Yisrael shlo osko b'Torah, because there was atzlas at that time, and the Klal Yisrael neglected Talmud Torah. Right? Nase sonu shel Hakadosh Baruch Hu moch. They became like impoverished, and therefore the Gezerah of Haman found a very an opportune time and place to appear, and this was because Be'atzaltayim Yimach HaMekora, that just as the roof is going to, you neglect your house, your roof is going to really cave in. That's what happened here. The whole situation kind of almost came to collapse because shelo osku b'Torah, right? It's interesting that Rebbe Lozer, of all the 15 opinions that are given here as to what the explanation should be, when you begin the Megillah, learning the Megillah, Rebbe Lozer was the only one who really brought related it to the inyan of Bittul Torah. And Rebbe Lozer, the Gemara says in Erevin, I think in Daf Nun Daled, it says that Ba'avosa Yushge Tomid, that a person who really personified this midah Ba'avosa Yushge Tomid, that he was always, that the Avas Torah was so great that he was always involved, always learning. That was Rebbe Lozer. And it said that he used to sit in Tveria, in the Shuk Elyon of Tveria, and his talis, some say his talis meant that he had some kind of business interest, he had a store or something, and it was in the Shuk Tachten, and he completely neglected it. And he didn't know it was because Ba'avosa Yushke Tomid, he was only interested in Talmud Torah. So he was the one that said that Ba'avosa Yushke Tomid, Rebbe Lozer, he was the one that attributed the Gezerah of Haman to this inyan of Bittul Torah. Okay. Remember that before, in that same sugya that we were discussing about Mevatl and Talmud Torah, so the Gemara brings another baraisa, and it says that, remember that there was the Gemara brings the Maisa, it says Vahi biyos Yeshua b'Yericho, when Yeshua was in Yericho, and the Malach approached him, and the Malach had drawn his sword, and Yeshua understood that the Malach was coming with a taina, with criticism, and the Malach said, after the Gemara records the Shakla V'taya, the conversation between Yeshua and the Malach, he criticizes Amalai Emesh B'taltim Tomed Shel Ben Aboyim. He told him that yesterday you neglected to bring the Tomed Shel Ben Aboyim. Right? You didn't bring the Tomed Shel Ben Aboyim. All right? Right? It's V'achshav B'taltim Talmud Torah. And now you were mevatel the entire Klal Yisrael from Talmud Torah. Okay. Then Rashi explains why exactly was he mevatel them from Talmud Torah. He said because it was nighttime already. It was ein zman milchama balayla. They could have learned. They could have organized learning, shiur and whatever. But that's what the Malach told. The Malach came with two criticisms of Yeshua, and he told him, "Emesh b'taltem Talmud shel ben Aboyim, v'achshav b'taltem Talmud Torah." Okay, Omalei, so he said to him, "Okay, al eza mehem basa." So, which, what really concerns you the most? He told him, "Omalei ata basi." He says, I came now. I didn't come. I said, "Emesh b'taltem Talmud shel ben Aboyim." I didn't come yesterday. Now that you're mevatel Talmud Torah, I came for this. It means that I came to be mochiach you for allowing the entire klal to be bottled from Talmud Torah. Miyad vayolen Yeshua balayla b'toch ha'emek v'amar Rabbi Yochanan b'lam shalon b'toch shalalocha. So Yeshua right away went to be masakin this, and he got people together, and they. It's interesting that Tosfos asks a question here. The Malach told him, criticism number one, Emesh b'taltem Talmud shel ben Aboyim, because this was during, remember that the campaign against the city, the Ai, right? They were besieging the Ai, and eventually remember that they were repulsed, and then they went back, and they were victorious. But when they were besieging the city of the Ai, so they evidently the siege took longer than anticipated. It went into and they weren't able to be makriv the Talmud shel ben Aboyim. So Tosfos asks a very, Tosfos says, "Tema lama betluah v'chila hoyu hakahanim yecholim lakriva Afal Pishi Yisrael Tsarin Hoili. What the Kohanim weren't fighting. The Kohanim were behind the lines someplace. The Kohanim had wherever they had encamped. Let them be makriv the Tamid Shel Ben Aboyim. Right? It's the Kohanim. They're the shluchim. Remember, we have the sugi of Kohanim Ashlucha Didan, Ashlucha Derachmona. Who shluchim are they precisely? Ashluchim the Torah, but nevertheless they're the shluchim to be makriv the karbonos. They weren't fighting. So Tosa said, "V'yeshlama devade hakohanim hikrivuhu, aval lahoyo lahen mamoda." So Tosa says that maybe they did, but they weren't. But remember that there was the carbon tamid had to be witnessed and it had to be supported by mamodas from Klal Yisrael. They weren't there because they were fighting, and in the end, Tosa rejects that. The Tosa says, "What do you want from the Yisrael? They were busy fighting." So Tosa says, in the end, he says that the Aron wasn't in its proper place, and he brings the Gemara in Erevin, and since the Aron wasn't in its proper designated place, they couldn't be makar of the carbon Tomid Shel Ben Aboyim. And the Malach held that this is a criticism because he said that evidently he was saying that the Aron should have been in its place. In other words, that the Aron wasn't, because at that time, remember, the Mishkan was brought with him. Evidently, the Mishkan had not yet been erected, right? And the Aron wasn't in the Kodesh HaKadoshim as it should be. So wherever it was or it wasn't, Tosfos said shows from the Gemara and Erevin that the Aron wasn't in its place, and therefore the Kohanim could not be makriv the Tamid Shel Ben Aboyim, right? And it wasn't an onus, the Malach pointed out, because you could have seen to it that the Mishkan should have been assembled, and the Aron should have been in its proper place, and although those of us that were fighting, the war would continue fighting, and you would be makar of the Tamid Shel Ben Aboyim. Right? Fine. This was the dialogue here. In any event, the Malach said, that's not why I came, although that was wrong, but I came because of the Bittul Torah. Fine. So I, in the margin on this sefer many years ago, I think that it's a very very good question. The Tosfos says that the reason that they were mevatel the Tamid Shel Ben Aboyim is because the Aron wasn't in its proper place. Now he doesn't explain exactly why. So the assumption is that the Kohanim had not assembled the Mishkan, and the Aron was being transported, and that somehow was ma'akev their ability to bring the Tamid Shel Ben Aboyim. Fine, that's what Tosfos says. However, if you remember the Gemara in the end of the first parak of Yuma, the Gemara makes a cheshbon that there were 5 things that were missing bisman bayesheni. There were 5 things that were present in the Mikdash Rishon and were not present in the Mikdash Sheni. Okay? And one of the Eish, which was Yoredis Min HaShamayim, okay, and the Urim V'Tumim wasn't there. The Choshen of the Kohen was, but the Urim V'Tumim that went inside was not, and the Aron wasn't there. During the Bayesheni, there was no Aron in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and therefore all of the time of the Bayesheni, when the Kohen Gadol would go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, he would go lifnayar, lifnim, and he would put the ketoras on the gecholim, which was the avodah lifnayar, lifnim on Yom Kippur, right? And in the Mikdash Rishon he would do it right between the 2 badim of the Aron. But in the Migdash Sheni there was no Aron, so he did it by the Even Shasiya. He did another, they approximated where the Mokum of the Bein Abadim was, and they did it, right? No, so this was the question that I asked, and I think that it's a legitimate question. I said, how could Tosfos say that they were unable to be makar of the Talmud Shel Ben Aboyim because the Aron wasn't in its proper place? No, for the 420 years of the Bayis Sheni, okay, there was no Aron. They were makar of all the karbonos, day in and day out. There was no, right? There was no interruption whatsoever of the Avodas Beis Hamikdash. There was no Aron. Not only wasn't in this, so there is a Manda Amma that says in Yuma that the Aron was buried in the Azara, that before the Nebuchadnezzar's forces invaded the Migdash, the Harabayas, the Migdash precincts, that the Kohanim dug in the Azara and hid the Aron there. And it was known where the Mokum of the Aron was. And the Gemara tells the Maisa that one of the Kohanim, Bizman Bayis Sheni, was about to uncover the place and he died. He was struck dead. Because evidently it was... But even so, the Aron wasn't in its Mokum. Even if you say that the Aron was there in the Beis Hamikdash, but it was buried, it was concealed, but it wasn't in its Mokum, right? The Tosfos says that they couldn't be makar, and certainly, according to those that don't agree with that in the Gemara, they say that the Aron was taken to Bovel, and again there was a work done years ago where there were archaeologists that claimed that they found certain proof that the Aron had been taken to some place in eastern Syria, and it still may be there. But whatever it wasn't in its proper place, its designated place, and it probably wasn't even in the Beis Hamikdash, right? And they were makar of all the karbonos, right? It's a good question, right? And Tosfos says that right to Baruch is a good question, right? Okay. So the thing is this. I drop more water. So the thing is this, that later on in Megillah, there was a question of the Kedusha Rishona and the Kedusha Shniya, which is the question is whether when Ezra brought the Bnei Hagola back to Eretz Yisrael to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash in the time of the Yovesh Hasheni, because remember there were two Dariuses, at least two. The first Darius, the Yovesh Harishon, was the son of Koresh. Okay, the second Darius was the son of Esther and Achashverosh. And if you remember, maybe Purim will have a chance to speak about it more. And there are those that say that the reason that the Chazal tell us that Achashverosh seemed to be more anxious to be rid of the Jewish nation than Haman was even. Right? He was more of a Soni Yisrael than Haman. And Bein Rega, he became the best friend. Right? Yeah, he'd take Haman's house, take Haman's position, take Haman's ring. And they explain that he had been told by his astronomers, his soothsayers, his magicians, his advisors, he had been told that his kingdom of Shava ve'Esr Mea Medina would one day fall into Jewish hands. And that panicked him, right? So then he became a gewaltig anti-Semit. And when Haman came to him with a plan, and he said, let's just wipe them out, let's eliminate them, wipe them from the face of the earth, he was all ears, right? And Kesef Nasanlov, do it, just get it done, right? Because he felt that they threatened his... Okay? When he became aware, at that moment, at Esther's second Mishnah, when he became aware that Esther was a Jewess, right? So he saw everything fell into place. He understood that since the din is that Eved va'akum habal bas Yisrael havlad is Yisrael, because that it goes according the Eved va'akum who live with a Jewish woman and produce a child, the child is a Yisrael. So he understood that which he had been told was true, that they would have a child, that child would inherit his kingdom, but it would be his child. The child would be legally in status, the child would be Jewish. So he was so he saw that he had been misled and he had been over apprehensive. That's very, very much bekitzer why Achashverosh seemed to be just in a moment everything shifted, right? Okay. So anyway, this is the Yovesh Hasheni. He was the one that issued the permit to continue the rebuilding of the second Beis Hamikdash, and in his time, the Beis Hamikdash was rebuilt. Fine, very good. And the question was, when Ezra, years before, after Koresh gave the initial permission to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, what was the original Kedushas Haaretz that had prevailed from the time of Yeshua ben Nun, was that still sufficient to affect the dinim of the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael? Or was it necessary for Ezra to be Mekadesh Eretz Yisrael again? No. Another, was the Kedusha bottled during that time? Right? Okay. And this is a machlokes, if Kedusha Rishona Kidsha Lashata v'Kidsha Losid Lovo, or was it only Kidsha Lashata that Yeshua ben Nun was Mekadesh Eretz Yisrael, but V'lo Kidsha Losid Lovo? Okay? So, Tosfos explains later on in Daf Yud. Tosfos explains that even the Manda Omar that says that the Kedusha Rishona was lo kitchele asid lava, right, and that Ezra had to be Mekadesh Eretz Yisrael again, that was le'inyan the Kedusha Sa'aretz Trumas and Maestras Bikurim Orla, Shemitah, whatever dinim, they are the mitzvahs hatluyas ba'aretz, okay? However, the Mokum HaMizbeach itself never lost its Kedusha. Understand? That the Mokum, and therefore, in all of the years of the Golas Bavel, although there was no Migdash, there was nothing, but they could be makriv, because whatever you hold regarding the Kedusha Haaretz, right? Did the Kedusha Haaretz have to be reinstated at the time of Ezra? But the Mokam HaMizbeach is a separate inyan totally, and the Kedusha HaMizbeach was La'ol Meyad. Okay? So if we follow that sheet and that's why it was based on this is the controversy which really revolves, around the Harabayas, and that's why one of the reasons that the Harabayas, the Mokam Hamigdash and the Mokam Hamizbeach, the Mokam of the Azoras, retains still its kedusha. Certainly the Mokam Hamizbeach. In any event, according to this day in the Tosfos, that the Mokam HaMizbeach never lost its Kedusha, and even at the time of the Churban, when it was B'chobana, you could be Makav. You couldn't be Makav during the 70 years of the Golas Bavel because there was no Efer Porah, there was no Paraduma, there were other things that were Ma'akav, the ability of the Kahanim to be Makav. But it wasn't because there wasn't a Mokam Kodesh. Okay? So now I think that the question that I'm asking about that Enoch Hanami, the Malach criticized Yeshua, and he said that why weren't you makriv the Tomid Shel Ben Arbaim last night? You're going to say because the Oren wasn't b'mekomo, right? It wasn't in the right place. No, what is it? And I'm asking, what does it matter that the Aron wasn't in Makama? You see, the 410 or 420 years of the Bayis Sheni, there was no Aron, right? And nevertheless, the Avodah Space Hamikdash proceeded in its entirety, right? However, what was there? There was the Mokum of the Mizbeach. And the Mokum HaMizbeach, the Kedusha of the Mokum HaMizbeach was never bottled, and it was Ke'ilu, the Mokum HaMizbeach was a Mizbeach. At the time of the Milchama against the eye, that the Malach reprimanded Yeshua regarding, there was a Mishkan. The Mishkan was one day it was here, one day it was there. The Mishkan wasn't assembled. There wasn't an Aron. There wasn't a Mokum of the Aron. There was nothing, right? But in the Bayis Sheni, although there was no Aron, there was a Mokum of the Aron. And so when Tosfos says that the Aron wasn't b'Mekom, Tosfos means to say there was no Aron, and alternatively there was no Mokum of the Aron either. So that the Malach criticized Yeshua, said, well, why didn't you assemble the Mishkan, and there would have been everything. But in the Zman of the Bayis Sheni, that was already a different situation. You had in the Zman of the Bayis Sheni, you had the Mokum of the Aron, it was there. So that was sufficient to allow and to be Mechayev that the Avodas Beis Hamikdash proceed uninterrupted. Because it's Lav Dafka the Aron, it's the Mokum of the Aron, which is the Mokum, which you remember when I was speaking, what we spoke about Shalashudas, that Yaakov Avinu said, Ein Zekim Beis Elokim, V'zeh Shar HaShamayim, that the Mokum with the Migdash Shel Mala and the Migdash Shel Mata are Mechuven, right? Migdash Hashem Konenu Yodecha in the plural, is the Mokum HaMizbeach. And that was the tradition tells us that was the mokum that Yaakov Avinu slept, and he said that Ochen Yesh Hashem b'mokum hazeh. And Rashi says that if I had known that this was such a mokum kodesh, I wouldn't have slept here. Okay, and that was the mokum that the Malach Alekim were oilim v'yodim bo. That was the Shar HaShamayim, and that was the mokum HaMizbeach, and that had kedusha la'ol meyad. It probably had the kedusha from the time of the Akedah. Of the Akedas Yitzchak, all right? Okay? So Memele, that's why, although in the time of Yeshua ben Nun, they weren't makar because there was no Aron, there was no Mokum. I mean, the Bayis Sheni, they were. Okay. Now, we said that the question of the Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, right, is whether at the time that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, whether the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael was bottled. So, and we've said that question doesn't it pertain to the Mokum HaMizbeach, right? The rest of that's a lenient Trumas and Maisas, Shvis, the mitzvahs hatluyas ba'aretz, Shemitah, okay. And one mandama holds that Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Ashata Veloy Kitchel Asid Lava, and when Ezra brought them back, he had to be Mekadesh Eretz Yisrael again, Le'inyan the Mitzvah Satluyas Baretz. And one of the mandama says, no, this is a machloikis Tanoim of the Tanoim. It's an old machloikis. There's another machloikis, and that machloikis is between Rabbah and Rebbe Lozer, in the end of the fourth parak in Gittin, and that is if yesh kinyan la'ovid kechovim lahafkia metumas ha'maisas. That Eretz Yisrael is kodesh. The mitzvahs hakliyus ba'aretz are noig, but a goy buys a field in Eretz Yisrael. So does he have the kinyan since it belongs now to Akum? Does his kinyan have the force to be mafkia that parcel of land from the chiyuv of Tumas and Maisas? In other words, that if a Yid, where he hires Jews to work for him, and they harvest the crops, and they do as has to be done, does that is that mafkia the chiyuv of Trumas Hamaisos, the fact that the karka is owned by a guy? Yes or no? That's a machlokas in the end of the fourth paragraph, the end of Hashaleach, between Rabba and Rebbe Loza. Rabba says no, Rebbe Loza says yes. Obviously, we paskin, we're going to paskin like Rabba. Well, I shouldn't say that it's a machlokas in the Rishonim how we paskin, but Rabba says it does not, and the land is still chayiv and Trumas and Maisos because kiliko loretz, and Rebbe Loza says it is mafkia. Fine. And the Mokam HaMizbeach is independent, is outside of this machlokas. You remember that, again, this is, what we've discussed so many times, that the Talmidim asked Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and they said, Mipnei man is chai v'saneim shel Yisrael kloya. What did they do that was such, after all, you're talking to the Gezerah, someone's lahashmid, laharag, labed. It was really, in a way, it was more severe than our Gezerah against Amalek. It's lahashmid, laharag, labed. And what was the pesha? What was the crime? Okay, one answer was that shenenu mesudasa shel Achashverosh, that they partook of the Suda of Achashverosh. That's one thing, and the final answer is that hishtachavu latzelem. They succumbed to the pressure that Nebuchadnezzar put on them, and they bowed to the tzelem that he erected. Fine. Okay. Right. However, the tzelem of Nebuchadnezzar, if one wanted to attempt that, you could understand why the tzelem of Nebuchadnezzar might be regarded as true avodah zarah, and anyone worshiping the tzelem of Nebuchadnezzar is right. Is chayav misa, because hishtachavo, bowing to avodah zarah, is a capital offense. Right? Chayav misa. On that, of course, there are many questions, because the entire Klal Yisrael wasn't there present. All those from the Sheva of Esther, Meir, Medina weren't there to worship and even those that did only did it under duress. So there are many, but nevertheless, the chet was a chet mishpat moves, we might say, right? It's avodah zarah, but the suda to ascribe the severity of the onesh of the gezerah shenene mesudasa shala. So analyze what was the suda of Achashverosh. The suda of Achashverosh, there was probably bishalakum, there was stam yayin. There was the al tismach yisrael al gil amim, that there was the association with the goyim by yisavu ba goyim v'yilmudum maseihem. There were many, but what is it in that the Gemara wanted to ascribe the severity of the onesh, the chomer hadin? It's a little bit, right? I remember maybe a few years after I came, and one year, so I began the Purim shir with this mimer. So all of Hashalom, the old Mr. Garazman was sitting right near me because he wasn't able to hear, so he wanted to sit. So he said, right, what's the big deal? Yeah, it's a good question. I said, you're asking the question that that many. What's the I say it's not right, well, it's not. However, listen what it says, that Achashverosh, when he sponsored this Suda and invited he gave everyone, you drink, because there was no really social pressure exerted on people that they have to drink a certain amount, that you have to show your ability to hold your liquor, there was none of that. Come, enjoy yourself, do as you want. His kavanah was was that he didn't want to have anyone able to say that, listen, they made me drunk, and that's why I made a fool of myself, I didn't behave myself. Yeah? Anyway, the Gemara explains, Vashsia chados ein ones. Ein ones b'yayin nesach, no one was forced to drink. Everyone was able to drink from whatever he felt his capacity was. Do as you want. Feel at home. Ein ones, what is the ein ones? Omer Rava, melamed shekol echad ve'echad hishkeyu yayin shel medinasa. That there he was a melech, an emperor over Sheva ve'esrim u'meya medina, and he imported wine, local wines from all over, and each nationality, people from each that were representing each country, nation, he would serve them their own wine. Okay? So, what does it mean? The Moldavians would have their wine, the Armenians would have their wine, the Turks would have their wine, right? Okay? And, by the same token, the Yidden would have their wine. He brought wine from Eretz Yisrael, right? Okay? That's what Rava says, Ein Oines. Rashi explains, what does it mean, Ein Oines? Because he gave people that which they're accustomed to drinking. It didn't have a negative effect on them. You give someone, perhaps wine, you'll serve a Jew wine, from Armenia, and he drinks it, maybe it won't agree with him, you understand? So, Ein Oines. He'll throw up, it'll make him sick, it'll make him drunk. Ein Oines. Okay, that's what the Rava says. Listen the way that the Chazal, the insight that they had, not only in the psukim, but in situations. Rabbah said, the Machlokas Rabbah and Rebbe Lazar in the end of the fourth parak of Gittin, if yesh kinyan la'akum lafkiyem chiyuv trumas ha'maisres. Rebbe Lazar says, you listen, if you, even though the Kedushas ha'aretz is intact, but if you sell legitimately, because remember, let's add one other thing, that one other element to this. You look in many sugyas, let's tell us about the Kedushin Daf Yudal and the Medbeis, you see that the Torah recognized a mechanism by which a goy could acquire property, an eved, real estate from a Jew. Okay? In other words, maybe you'll say that the goy understand that we're so, what would we call ourselves, so ethnocentric, that we would say that no, a goy can't, but no, that's not the case. The Torah recognized the ability of the goy to purchase from a Yid. It's done legitimately, right? He pays. There are certain kinyonim, and it's his. So Rebbe Lazar says that the goy bought Karka and Eretz Yisrael from a Yid. The Torah recognized his kinyan if it was done legitimately. Mamela, it's not, he's mafkia it from the chiyuv of Tumas and Maishas, right? Rabbi says no. Rabbi says that's not the case. Rabbi says that in the Choshen Mishpat, the title, the deed, right, the goy can own the land. But although Rabbi doesn't say it, but I would add by way of explanation. Moshe, you'll tell me if I'm right, okay? Okay, you'll be so kind. Okay. The Torah says that after 50 years you buy it. Legal, signed, sealed, delivered. But even after 50 years it goes back. It reverts. So it means you don't have absolute. You can't sell. How much you can sell, you sell. But kilikolet, right? Ha'aret los timochel it's misus. Kilikolet, it's mine. No. So Rabbah says, so by the same token, why there's no contradiction here. The goy, it belongs to him. His kinyan is legitimate. It's his. You can't steal from him. You can't take from him. You can't be masig vul because it's his. But nevertheless, right? Kili kol aretz. The kedusha haaretz you cannot sell, and therefore the kedusha. And that if the peiros and the tvua is harvested and processed in a way that's mechayev and meiseres, it's still chayev and meiser, right? Makes sense? Good, thank you. Now, look what happens here. Rabbah is the one that says that the Akum does not have the kinyan, right? You can't, because Kili Kolaretz, you can't be mafkia under any circumstances the chiyuv of Tumas and Maisras, right? Okay. Whose Talmud was Rabbah is who? Is Rabbah Banachmeni.